She arrived in the New World in December of 1733, barely 15, full of hope. The world beckoned her with possibilities. Having left poverty and despair in Ireland, and having survived near starvation and an icy disaster at sea, she and her companion, Richard Wright, would start anew as indentured servants to William Weiss, a colonist already established. Weiss had also already established a reputation. He had crossed the sea accompanied by a prostitute he passed off as his daughter, and was so ill-tempered and belligerent that James Oglethorpe, founder of the colony of Georgia and of Savannah, had relegated him to Hutchinson Island to raise cattle. The other settlers reportedly were happy to see him leave. As for Alice and Richard, they had little choice but to follow, having been assigned to Weiss to satisfy their 7 years as indentured servants. What would have been their fate and the fate of William Weiss had Oglethorpe chosen another? By all accounts, Alice and Richard tried to meet Weiss's needs, handling the household chores, doing the numbing work of tending the cattle and farm, and of course there was the daily grooming. Alice must have dreaded that most of all, being forced to bathe the old man each day. Later, after her trial, there would be talk of his brutal abuse of the young girl, verbal, physical, even sexual. With time, when Alice and Richard could take no more, nowhere to turn, no one to talk to, servants in a foreign world on an isolated island, they plotted to kill William Weiss, to run away and live free in another part of the New World. Charleston, perhaps, but somewhere away. Was the exact day and time planned carefully in advance? Or was it simply that on that morning of Monday, March 1st, 1734, they could suffer no longer? Whatever the case, on that morning, William Weiss, a neckerchief gathered around his neck, lay as usual, stretched out on his bed, waiting to be bathed by Alice and attended by Richard. As usual, Richard brought in the wooden hooped bucket filled with gray water and soap made from animal fat and wood ashes. As usual, Alice and Richard began the daily ritual. Did they hesitate, struggling to summon their courage as the old man lay on his bed, eyes closed? Did he lay quietly, still and at peace, unsuspecting of what was to follow? Or did he reach furtively out to touch Alice as she bathed him, making one last lecherous transgression? Whatever occurred, whatever thoughts they had on that morning, Richard within moments made his decision, suddenly tightening the neckerchief around the old man's neck. The old man's eyes must have bulged, and his face must have reddened as he gasped for breath. Alice, leaping forward, shoved Wise's aged head deep into the water of the bucket, the two holding their master there as he twisted and strained until he moved no more. Did they feel an instantaneous, sickening epiphany of horror at what they had done? Did they feel a monstrous burden of guilt for taking another's life, whether they felt justified or not? Who can now see into their hearts? We know only that they ran wildly, desperately from the farm, only to be found just days thereafter, miles away, ironically on the Isle of Hope. Richard, when caught, begged for his life, but was hanged almost immediately after his trial in May of 1734. But Alice spent months in jail awaiting her execution, for after a trial on examination she had been found to be pregnant. Whether by Richard or William, no one could say. What sad thoughts must have gone through her head as she mourned for her lost companion, alone in her jail cell, awaiting her execution? Did she feel guilt for her part in the murder of an old man, however he may have mistreated her? What fears she must have felt as she pondered her approaching death, and perhaps worse, the fate of her soon-to-be-born baby, alone in the new world. She would not be hanged until January 19th, 1735, after the birth of her baby. Some say her body swung on the gallows erected in Wright Square for days before being removed. Her son James would die weeks later, and both would be buried a few blocks away at 9 West York Street, where reports of sightings, especially at night, continue even now. And even now, especially late in the evening, passers-by will sometimes report a lone young woman, dressed in archaic clothing, roaming Wright Square, searching endlessly, hopelessly, for her lost baby in the moonlight and the shadows.